The galactic diplomatic station known as Thornhelm Nexus hung like a silver crown in the empty space between three star systems. And on this particular cycle, it was full of teeth and claws and creatures that could kill each other in 17 different ways before breakfast. Ambassador Cale Marin of Earth stepped off the shuttle ramp and into the main receiving hall with his back straight and his expression calm, and his 7-year-old daughter Lily holding his hand and looking around with eyes the size of small moons. This was not the plan. The plan had been simple and clean and professional. Arrive at the Accord of Coexistence with a team of diplomats and translators and security officers. Shake some alien hands or claws or tentacles, negotiate trade agreements, and go home without causing an interstellar incident. But then the childcare arrangement on Earth had fallen apart at the last possible second, and Cale's ex-wife had been deployed to a research station on Europa, and his mother had caught a flu that knocked her flat, and suddenly there was nobody left to watch Lily for 3 weeks. So Lily came to space. The Xeno diplomatic liaison who met them at the dock was a tall insectoid creature named Vreth, who served as the station's protocol officer. And when Vreth saw Lily standing there in her little red jacket with a cartoon dinosaur on the back, all 4 of Vreth's compound eyes blinked at once in a pattern that the translation software marked as extreme alarm. Ambassador Marin, Vreth said, in a voice like dry leaves scraping together, "You have brought a juvenile of your species to Thornhelm Nexus." "I have," Cale said. "To a station currently hosting delegations from 14 apex predator species." "That is correct." Vreth's antennae folded flat against the top of its head, which was the insectoid equivalent of grabbing someone by the shoulders and shaking them while screaming. "She will be fine," Cale said, and he squeezed Lily's hand, and Lily smiled up at Vreth and waved. Vreth did not wave back. Across the station in the high-security diplomatic wing, the most dangerous delegation at the Accord was settling into their quarters with the kind of quiet efficiency that only came from military discipline. The Vashkari were 6-limbed reptilian predators who stood nearly 3 meters tall and moved with a liquid grace that made other species instinctively want to run in the opposite direction and never stop running. Their scales shifted color with their moods, deep green for calm, black for anger, and a bright burning orange for the hunting state that their kind called the Red Focus. The delegation was called the Iron Fang Pack, and they were not diplomats in any traditional sense. They were warriors who had been assigned to diplomatic duty because the Vashkari believed that all negotiations were simply another form of combat. Was Dominant Rethka, a female who had earned her rank through 40 confirmed kills in sanctioned duels, and who wore the scars across her snout like medals. Rethka stood at the viewport of her quarters and watched the human shuttle dock, and she felt nothing but a mild and distant contempt. Humans were new to the galactic stage, barely 2 decades since first contact, and in that time they had done nothing to impress the Vashkari. They were small and soft and slow, and they had no claws and no venom and no natural armor, and their teeth were flat little things that could barely tear through cooked meat. The Vashkari classification system had placed them at Tier 6, which was the category reserved for minor prey species who had somehow stumbled into sapience through sheer evolutionary luck. "The humans have brought a hatchling," her second-in-command Torvak reported, his scales flickering with amusement. Rethka turned from the viewport, and her eyes narrowed. "A juvenile," she repeated. "A small female, perhaps 7 or 8 of their solar cycles old." Rethka's lip curled back to show the row of serrated teeth that lined her upper jaw, and a sound came from her throat that was the Vashkari equivalent of a disbelieving laugh. "They bring their young to a predator's gathering," she said, "like a grazing animal wandering into an open field surrounded by hunters, too stupid to know the danger." Torvak's scales rippled in agreement. "It confirms the assessment," he said, They are prey that learn to talk. Meanwhile, Lily Marin was having the best day of her entire life. Everything was amazing, and everything was new, and everything had a smell and a texture and a story that she wanted to learn immediately. She pressed her face against every window and asked her father what each species was called, and where they came from, and what they ate, and whether they were friendly. Every question with the patience of a man who had been answering questions non-stop for 7 years. "Those are the Faliri," he said, as a group of tall feline creatures stalked past them in the corridor, their movements graceful and their eyes gleaming like polished copper. "They are from a jungle world, and they are very proud of their fur." "Can I pet them?" Lily asked. "Absolutely not." "Can I pet them later?" Also no. Lily accepted this with the temporary obedience of a child who fully intended to revisit the question at a more strategically advantageous time. On the second day of their stay, a new cargo shipment arrived at the station's xenobiology wing, part of Earth's contribution to the Galactic Fauna Exchange Program, a scientific initiative where member species shared biological specimens for study and classification. Most of Earth's contributions were unremarkable: samples of coral and pressed flowers and carefully preserved insects. In glass cases. But one container held a live specimen. The creature inside was about 70 centimeters long and covered in coarse black and silver fur, and it had small dark eyes that burned with an intensity that seemed far too large for its body. It was a honey badger. Its official file listed it as Mellivora capensis, a mustelid native to Africa and parts of Asia, and the xenobiology team gave it a cursory scan and placed it in a standard containment unit rated for medium-threat fauna. This was their first mistake. Their second mistake was assuming that a standard containment unit meant anything at all to a honey badger. Within 6 hours, the creature had chewed through the locking mechanism of its enclosure, torn a ventilation grate off the wall with its claws, and disappeared into the maintenance tunnels of Thornhelm Nexus, like a furry little demon with a personal grudge against the concept of captivity. The station AI issued a Level 3 biological hazard alert, which meant that something dangerous was loose, and all personnel should exercise caution. Lily was sitting in the diplomatic lounge eating a bowl of something that tasted almost like strawberry ice cream when the alert scrolled across the public information screen. She read the words carefully, sounding them out the way her teacher had taught her. "Escaped Terran specimen," she whispered. "Honey badger." Her eyes went wide and bright, and a smile spread across her face that would have terrified anyone who knew what it meant. She looked around the lounge and saw that her father was deep in conversation with a delegation of tall crystalline beings who spoke in harmonic tones that made the air shimmer. He was not watching her. Lily slid off her chair very quietly and walked to the door and stepped into the corridor, and the door closed behind her with a soft hiss. She was going to find that honey badger. Find it, and she was going to hold it. And nobody in this entire galaxy was going to stop her. The honey badger moved through the maintenance tunnels of Thornhelm Nexus with the confidence of a creature that had never once in its entire evolutionary history considered the possibility that it might not be the most dangerous thing in any given room. It was not large, and it was not fast in the way that the great predator species of the galaxy were fast, but it had something that no amount of size or speed could replace. It simply did not care. It did not care that it was on an alien space station thousands of light years from the African savanna, where its ancestors had spent millions of years picking fights with lions and winning. It did not care that the air smelled wrong, and the walls were made of metal instead of earth, and the lights hummed with a frequency that made its whiskers twitch. It cared about 3 things: getting out of the box they had put it in, finding something to eat, and absolutely destroying anything that got in its way. Did those 2 things. A maintenance drone floated around a corner and scanned the creature with a blue light. and the honey badger lunged at it, and sank its teeth into the drone's hydraulic line, and ripped it clean out. And the drone dropped to the floor, sparking and twitching, and the honey badger walked over it without a backward glance. 3 levels up in the xenobiology wing, Dr. Quellis was having what could only be described as a professional crisis. Dr. Quellis was a historian, a centipede-like species with 42 legs, and a body that stretched nearly 4 meters long, and a brain that could process biological data faster than most computers. Quellis had spent 200 years classifying the dangerous fauna of 1,000 worlds, and in all that time had never once raised a biological threat assessment above level 4 for any creature under 20 kilograms in mass. Until today. The honey badger's file was open on the holographic display in front of him. Quellis, and every new line of data made another pair of Quellis's legs curl inward with anxiety. Skin thickness, Quellis read aloud to the assembled security team. Approximately 6 millimeters of loose, tough hide that can rotate freely around the underlying muscle, meaning that even if a predator gets its teeth into the creature, the honey badger can twist inside its own skin and bite back. The room was very quiet. Pain response, Quellis continued, functionally negligible. The species produces elevated levels of endorphins that allow it to continue fighting through injuries that would incapacitate most mammals. And field observations from Earth suggest that honey badgers have been documented surviving venomous snake bites that would kill animals 10 times their size, after which they simply take a short nap and then get up and eat the snake. A Faliri security officer made a sound in the back of her throat that was somewhere between a hiss and a growl. Whimper. Aggression index, Quellis said, and then paused and looked at the number again, and blinked all 16 of its eyes in sequence. The aggression index is, well, the scale only goes to 10, and the Earth scientists who submitted this file have written the number 10 and then drawn a small arrow pointing upward, which I believe is meant to indicate that the scale is insufficient. Dominant Rethka stood at the back of the briefing room with her arms folded across her broad chest, and her scales had shifted from their usual confident green to something closer to a dark and muddy teal, which was the Vashkari color for uncertainty. She had fought creatures twice her size on her homeworld, and she had never once felt uncertain. But this small furry thing from the human planet was not behaving according to any predatory logic she understood. Predators were supposed to calculate risk. They were supposed to weigh the cost of a fight against the benefit of a fight, meal, and make rational decisions based on survival. This creature did not calculate anything. It simply attacked. The creature must be neutralized before it reaches the diplomatic levels, the station security chief announced. I am requesting the assistance of the Vashkari delegation, given their combat expertise. Rethka unfolded her arms, and her claws slid out with a soft click. My pack will handle it, she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite as steady as it should have been. The Iron Fang pack moved into the lower corridors in full combat formation. Rethka at the point, Torvak on her left flank, and 4 more warriors spread in a hunting pattern that covered every angle of approach. Their claws were fully extended, and their scales had gone dark with focus, and their subvocal hunting calls pulsed through the air at frequencies that most species could not hear, but could feel in their bones like a deep and terrible pressure. They were taking this seriously. They were treating a creature that weighed 12 kilograms the same way they would treat a rival apex predator on their homeworld. And none of them felt embarrassed about it, because they had all read the file. 7 levels below the diplomatic wing, Lily Marin was also on the hunt. She had slipped away from the diplomatic lounge with the practiced ease of a child who had spent years perfecting the art of quiet disappearance. And now she moved through the lower corridors with purpose. She was not afraid. This was important to understand because it was not that Lily was too young to recognize danger or too naive to understand that she was in a place full of creatures that could hurt her. She understood all of that perfectly well. She simply was not afraid because fear was not the first thing that came to her when she thought about animals. Her mother had been a wildlife veterinarian before she went to Europa, and Lily had grown up watching her mother handle creatures that bit and scratched and hissed and struck. And her mother had always been calm and always been gentle, and always said the same thing. They are more scared of you than you are of them, baby. And if you are patient and kind, they will show you who they really are. So Lily followed the trail that the honey badger had left behind. Scratches on the walls at a height that was just about right for a small and very angry mustelid. A chewed-through cable here, a destroyed sensor node there, and a faint musky smell that she recognized from the nature documentaries she had watched approximately 1,000 times. She talked to herself as she walked, narrating in a whisper like the documentary hosts she admired. "The honey badger has moved through this section recently," she said softly. "You can tell by the claw marks on the wall panel. They are fresh and deep, which means the subject is healthy, strong, and probably very grumpy." She did not know that the station's surveillance system was picking up every word she said and broadcasting it to the Security Command Center, where a room full of alien officers watched a human child track a Class 9 persistence predator through maintenance tunnels with the calm narration of a tiny nature documentary host. Nobody in that room was breathing. The Vashkari were closing in from the north corridor, and Lily was approaching from the south, and between them, in a junction where 3 corridors met, the honey badger had found a maintenance bot, and was in the process of dismantling it with its teeth and claws, not because the bot was a threat, but because the bot existed, and the honey badger had decided that this was unacceptable. Lily turned a corner and stopped. There it was, 10 meters ahead of her in the junction. The honey badger stood on top of the wrecked maintenance bot, with its fur bristling and its back arched and its small dark eyes burning with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than instinct, somewhere that was almost spiritual in its intensity. There was blood on its claws, hydraulic fluid from the bot, not real blood, but it looked real enough. It saw her and it hissed. At the other end of the junction, Rethka and the Iron Fang pack rounded the corner in perfect formation, and Rethka's eyes found 2 things at once. The creature on the destroyed bot bristling with rage, and the small human child standing alone in the corridor, with no weapons and no armor and no protection of any kind. Rethka's hearts, she had 3, all seemed to stop at once. She was about to watch a juvenile die. The junction corridor was 8 meters wide, and lit by cold white panels in the ceiling, and it smelled like machine oil and burnt wiring, and the sharp musk of an animal that had decided the entire universe was its enemy. The honey badger stood on top of the destroyed maintenance bot, and its lips were pulled back to show teeth that were short and thick and built for crushing bone, and its body was coiled tight, like a spring made of muscle and fury. At one end of the corridor stood Lily Marin, 7 years old, 41 pounds, wearing a red jacket with a cartoon dinosaur on the back. At the other end stood the Iron Fang pack of the Vashkari, 6 elite predators, each standing nearly 3 meters tall, with claws that could tear through ship hull plating, scales dark with hunting focus, and combined combat experience measured in centuries. The surveillance feeds from this corridor were now being watched by the entire Security Command Center, and also by every diplomat in the station who had access to a screen, because someone in the command center had accidentally broadcast the feed to the public channel, and nobody had thought to turn it off, because nobody could look away. Rethka raised one clawed hand in a fist, the Vashkari signal for absolute stillness. Her pack froze. Every muscle locked, and every breath held, and every instinct screaming, because they were predators watching a small helpless creature about to be attacked by another creature, and the urge to act was burning through their nervous systems like fire. But Rethka did not give the order to move. She did not give the order because she had seen something that stopped her cold. The child was not afraid. Rethka had spent her entire life reading body language. It was how the Vaskari hunted, how they negotiated, how they loved and fought and survived, and she could read fear in any species she had ever encountered. Everywhere in the galaxy, the tension in the limbs, the dilation of the eyes, the chemical shift in the scent, the tiny involuntary tremors that said, "I know I might die." The child had none of it. None. Lily dropped to her knees. She did it slowly and carefully, lowering herself until she was sitting on her heels, with her hands resting on her thighs, and she made herself small in a way that was clearly deliberate and clearly practiced. "Hey, buddy," she said. Her voice was soft and steady and warm like sunlight through a window. The honey badger hissed louder and shifted its weight, and its claws scraped against the metal of the destroyed bot. "Hey," Lily said again, I know you are really upset right now, and that is okay. That is totally okay." She extended one hand, palm up, fingers relaxed, and held it out in the space between them like an offering. The honey badger's eyes locked onto the hand, and its hissing dropped half. In the corridor behind Lily, invisible to her, Torvak leaned toward Rethka and whispered in subvocal, "Dominant, the creature will take her hand off at the wrist." Rethka said nothing. She could not speak, because something was happening inside her chest that she did not have a name for, a pressure that was not pain and not fear, but something else entirely, something that felt like watching a sunrise on a world she had never visited. Lily did not move her hand. The honey badger snapped at the air, a warning bite that closed on nothing, a sound like a small sharp clap, and Lily did not flinch. She did not flinch. The Faleri security officers watching the feed from the command center physically recoiled from the screen when the creature snapped, their feline reflexes firing involuntarily, but the human child sitting on the floor 10 meters from the animal did not move a single muscle. "You are okay," Lily said. "You are just scared, and that is okay, because everything here is weird and different, and you do not know where you are. And I would be mad too if someone put me in a box and took me to space without asking." She lowered her gaze, not looking directly at the honey badger's eyes, not challenging it, just existing in the same space with a patience that seemed impossible for a creature her age. The honey badger stepped off the destroyed bot, one paw and then another, and then it was on the floor, and it was moving toward her hand, with its body still low and its fur still raised, but something had shifted. The hissing had stopped, and the teeth were covered, and the small dark eyes were focused on her fingers with an expression that was no longer rage. It was curiosity. Lily hummed. It was a melody that she had learned from her mother, something simple and tuneless and soft that her mother used to hum when she was working with frightened animals at the clinic, a sound that meant nothing. Except, "I am here, and I am not going to hurt you." The honey badger reached her hand. It sniffed her fingers, one quick inhalation, and then another longer one. And its whiskers brushed against her skin, and Lily held perfectly still. Then it pressed its nose into her palm. Lily scratched behind its ears with 2 fingers, very gently, finding the spot where the fur was softest. The honey badger made a sound. It was a low, churring rumble that came from deep in its chest, a sound that no xenobiologist on the station had ever heard a honey badger make, a sound that the species reserved for only 2 situations: communication between a mother and her young, and the rare and precious moments when a honey badger decided that something in the world was not an enemy. The creature's fur flattened, and its body relaxed, and it leaned into Lily's hand like a cat pressing against a friendly touch. Lily picked it up. She slid both hands under its body, and lifted it, and cradled it against her chest with its head tucked under her chin. And the honey badger, the Class 9 Persistence Predator that had destroyed 3 drones and terrorized an entire space station and made elite alien warriors move in combat formation, curled into her like it had been waiting its whole life for exactly this. It closed its eyes, its claws retracted. It made the churring sound again, softer now, and its breathing slowed. In the corridor behind her, Dominant Rethka felt her claws retract. She did not decide to retract them. They simply pulled back into their sheaths on their own, and she felt them go with a distant surprise, like watching her own body do something without permission. She looked down at her hands, and then she looked at her pack, and she saw the same thing happening to all of them. Torvok's claws pulled in, and his scales shifted from hunting black to a pale and trembling green that Rethka had never seen on him before. The 4 warriors behind him mirrored the change. One by one, their claws retracted, and their combat postures softened, and their hunting calls went silent. 6 elite Vashkari predators stood in a corridor with their weapons sheathed, and their bodies open, and their ancient predator instincts overridden by something they could not name and could not fight. They had not been ordered to stand down. They had not made a conscious choice. Something deeper than thought had looked at what the child was doing, something that lived in the oldest part of their brains, where instinct was written in chemical and electricity. And that something had simply said, "This is not a threat, this is not prey, this is something sacred, and you will not touch it." Rethka stared at the small human child, holding the most irrationally violent creature she had ever been briefed on. And the creature was purring, and the child was humming, and the corridor was quiet. "Is she?" Rethka whispered. Nobody answered because nobody knew. Footsteps echoed from the corridor behind the Vashkari, and Ambassador Kale Marin came around the corner at a near run, flanked by 2 human security officers with weapons drawn. He stopped. He saw his daughter sitting on the floor of an alien space station, holding a honey badger like a stuffed animal, while 6 of the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy stood frozen around her with expressions that he, even as a non-Vashkari, could only describe as awe. Kale Marin closed his eyes and let out a long breath through his nose. "Lily," he said. "Dad, look," Lily said, turning to him with a smile so bright it could have powered the station. "He likes me." Kale looked at the honey badger, asleep against his daughter's chest, and then he looked at Dominant Rethka, whose scales were cycling through colors he was fairly sure no human had ever seen a Vashkari display. Wrecked maintenance bot, and the claw marks on the walls, and the sparking remains of a drone. He sighed the sigh of a father who had seen this exact kind of chaos before, and who knew with absolute certainty that it would happen again. "Yes," he said quietly, "he does." The footage spread across the galactic infonet like a wildfire burning through dry grass, and within 12 hours there was not a single connected world in the Orion Arm that had not seen it. The video was simple: a small human child kneeling on the floor of a maintenance corridor and taming a creature that the entire station had classified as a biological hazard, while 6 of the most elite predators in the galaxy stood behind her with their claws retracted and their bodies frozen in something that looked very much like reverence. It played on screens in embassy halls and military academies and university lecture theaters and the living spaces of 100 different species. And everywhere it played, it left silence in its wake. The reactions varied. The herbivore races, the gentle Morvathi with their long necks and wide, careful eyes, the burrowing Telek, who built their civilizations underground, the floating Yenish, who drifted through gas-giant atmospheres, like living clouds, watched the footage and felt a new kind of fear settle into their bones. The humans could tame death-world predators with their bare hands, not with technology, and not with weapons, and not with containment fields, but with their hands and their voices, and some invisible force that the herbivore races could not measure or defend against. The predator races reacted differently, but no less intensely. The Faliri watched the footage in their quarters aboard Thornhelm Nexus, and their fur stood on end, and they spoke in low voices about what it meant when a species could make an apex creature submit without dominance, without pain, without any of the tools that every predator in the galaxy understood. The Krethvari, massive armored beings who resembled walking tanks and who had conquered their homeworld through sheer unstoppable force, watched it 3 times, and then their delegation leader quietly requested that the threat assessment for humanity be moved up 4 tiers. But nobody reacted more profoundly than the Vashkari. In the briefing hall on the station's diplomatic level, Dr. Quellis stood before an assembly of diplomats and military observers and scientists from 30 different species, and delivered what would later be called the most important xenobiological analysis in galactic history. Quellis moved slowly across the stage on 42 legs, each step precise and deliberate, and the holographic display behind the doctor showed images from Earth. A wolf lying beside a human campfire 10,000 years ago, a child riding a horse, a falconer with a hawk on her wrist, a diver swimming alongside a shark, and finally, Lily Marin holding the honey badger. "We have made an error," Quellis said, and the translator carried the words to every species in the room in their own language. "We have made a fundamental error in our classification of humanity, and it is an error born from the limitations of our own experience." Quellis paused, and 16 eyes swept across the audience. "We classified humans as prey," Quellis continued, "because they lack natural weapons, no claws, no venom, no armor, no speed advantage, no biological threat display of any meaningful kind. And by every metric we use to measure predatory capability, they score at the bottom of the scale." The Vashkari delegation sat in the front row, and Rethka's scales were the pale green of deep attention. "But we were measuring the wrong thing," Quellis said. "We were measuring their ability to kill when we should have been measuring their ability to connect." The holographic display shifted to show a timeline of human-animal relationships stretching back tens of thousands of years. "Humans are not apex predators," Quellis said. "They are apex integrators. They are the only known species in the galaxy that systematically forms voluntary cooperative bonds with other species across biological boundaries, including species that are capable of killing them. They took wolves, pack hunters with jaws that could crush bone, and turned them into companions that sleep in their beds and protect their young," Quellis said. "They took horses, prey animals 5 times their size, and formed partnerships so deep that human and horse moved as one organism on the battlefield. And they took cats, solitary ambush predators, and somehow convinced them to live in their homes, although the cats appear to believe it was their idea. Patience and kindness." Quellis turned to face the Vashkari delegation directly. "The question is not whether humans are dangerous," Quellis said. "The question is why they chose to reach out to us with open hands when they could have come with closed fists. Because make no mistake, a species that can turn wolves into allies and ride horses into war and hold honey badgers like babies is a species that understands exactly how dangerous the universe is. And they came to meet us anyway." The briefing ended, and the hall emptied slowly and quietly, and Rethka sat in her seat long after her pack had risen, and she stared at the frozen image on the screen, and she felt something cracking inside her chest, like ice breaking on a river in spring. 2 hours later, she sent a formal request to Ambassador Marin for a private audience. Kale met her in a small conference room on the neutral level of the station. Just the 2 of them. No translators, no aides, no security. Because Rethka had specifically requested that, and Kale had agreed, because he had read enough about Vashkari culture to know that what she was asking for was personal. Rethka stood when he entered, and she was nearly twice his height and 3 times his mass, and every part of her was built to intimidate and overwhelm. But her scales were the soft pale green of vulnerability, and her claws were fully retracted, and her posture was something Kale had never seen in any briefing file about the Vashkari. She looked uncertain. "Ambassador," she said. "Dominant Rethka," he replied. There was a pause that stretched like a rope pulled tight between 2 points, and in that pause, 1,000 years of Vashkari military pride fought against something new and unnamed that was trying to be born. "I have come to say that we were wrong," Rethka said. Her voice was steady, but her scales betrayed her. They flickered through 3 different colors in rapid succession, which, Kale knew, meant that she was experiencing emotions that her species did not have easy words for. "Wrong about what?" he asked. "About your kind," she said. "About all of it. The classification, the assessment, the assumption that you were soft and weak and beneath us. All of it was wrong. And I say this not because the doctor's presentation convinced me with data, but because I stood in that corridor, and I watched your daughter do something that I could not do." She looked at her own hands, massive scaled things with retractable claws that could open steel, and she flexed them slowly. "On my world," she said, "we earn submission through pain. We fight, and the one who bleeds more yields. And this is how we have done things since before we had language, since before we had fire. Dominance through force, respect through violence, and there is no other way. There has never been another way." She looked at Kale, and her eyes were bright and wet, in a way that he could not ignore. Suspected very few beings in the galaxy had ever seen from a Vashkari dominant. "Your child earned that creature's submission through something I do not have a word for," she said. "Not in my language, and not in any language I have ever learned. She did not dominate it, and she did not trick it, and she did not force it. She simply sat with it and was kind, and the creature chose her." Another silence stretched between them. "Do your young?" Rethka asked, and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Do they all do this?" Kale Marin looked at the towering alien warrior standing before him, with her defenses down, and her pride stripped bare, and her 3 hearts beating with something that might have been hope, or might have been fear, or might have been both at once. "Most children on Earth grow up wanting to pet every animal they meet," he said quietly. "We have to teach them not to. Their first instinct, before fear and before logic, is to reach out and try to make a friend." Rethka was silent for a very long time. Then she did something that Kale knew, from every diplomatic briefing, and every cultural study, and every historical record he had ever read. No Vashkari dominant had ever done to a non-Vashkari in the entire recorded history of their civilization. She bowed her head and exposed the back of her neck. It was the deepest sign of respect in Vashkari culture. The offering of the most vulnerable point on their body, the place where a killing blow would land, freely given without combat or coercion. Kale stood very still, and he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like gravity. "Thank you," he said, because it was the only thing that felt true enough to say. Rethka raised her head, and her scales had settled into a color he had never seen described in any file. Something warm and deep and steady, like embers glowing in the dark. She returned to her pack, and they looked at her, and they asked what the humans had said, and Rethka stood among her warriors, and she said words that would be remembered long after the accord was over. "We have been classifying them as prey," she said, "and we were wrong. They are not predators either. They are something the galaxy has never seen, and we should be grateful that they reached out with open hands instead of closed fists." The Grand Assembly Hall of Thornhelm Nexus was the largest enclosed space on the station, a vast circular chamber with tiered seating that rose in concentric rings around a central stage. And on the final day of the Accord of Coexistence, every seat was filled. Delegations from 47 species sat in their designated sections, and the air hummed with translation fields that turned 100 different languages into something each listener could understand, and the light from the station's artificial sun poured through the crystal ceiling and made the whole room glow like the inside of a cathedral. Today, the Assembly would vote on humanity's formal classification within the galactic hierarchy. This was not a small thing. The classification would determine everything: trade rights, territorial allowances, military standing, diplomatic weight, and the fundamental legal status of every human being in the galactic community for the next 100 years. The existing classification was Tier 6, which was the category for minor prey species, and Tier 6 meant almost nothing. Limited trade access, no territorial expansion rights, no military alliances, and a diplomatic voice so small that it was essentially decorative. The humans sat in their section, and Ambassador Kale Marin kept his face neutral and his hands folded in his lap. And beside him, Lily sat with the honey badger curled in her arms, because nobody on the station had been willing to try to take it away from her. And the xenobiology team had quietly filed paperwork transferring custody of the specimen to the Marin family under a provision that nobody had ever used before, because nobody had ever needed to. The creature had been named Sergeant Grumbles. This was Lily's doing. The voting procedure began with classification proposals from each major power block, and the first three proposals were predictable. The Herbivore Coalition proposed Tier 5, which was only one step above prey and still carried severe limitations. The Academic Bloc proposed Tier 4 with a special research designation, and the minor predator races proposed Tier 3, which would have given humanity moderate standing, but nothing remarkable. Then Dominant Rethko rose from her seat. The hall went quiet in the way that a room always goes quiet when the most dangerous person in it stands up. Not a gradual silence, but a sudden and complete one, like the air itself had decided to stop moving. Rethko walked to the central stage with the fluid grace of her kind, and her scales with a deep steady green of absolute certainty, and her eyes swept across the assembly with the calm authority of a being who had never once in her life spoken words she did not mean. "I speak for the Vashkari Dominion," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the hall without amplification, because Vashkari vocal cords were designed to be heard across open plains. "And I speak also for the Iron Fang Pack, who have served as our delegation to this accord." She paused and let the weight of her rank and her scars and her reputation settle over the assembly like a heavy blanket. "The existing proposals for human classification are inadequate," she said, "not because they are too low or too high, but because they attempt to place humanity into a system that was not built for what humanity is." Murmuring rippled through the tiers. "Our classification system has two paths," Rethka continued, "predator and prey. You are one or the other, and your tier within that path determines your standing. And this system has served us for 1,000 years because every species we have encountered has fit neatly into one category or the other." She turned slowly, making eye contact with delegation after delegation. "Humanity does not fit," she said. "I have seen their world's biological record. They took wolves, apex pack hunters, with jaws built to crush bone, and they did not kill them, or cage them, or break them. They befriended them, and turned them into partners and companions, and those wolves became a new thing entirely, a thing that slept beside human children and guarded them with its life." Her scales brightened with each sentence. "They took horses, massive prey animals that could trample them, and they built a bond so deep the human and horse became a single creature on the battlefield. They took birds of prey, solitary hunters that strike from the sky, and taught them to return to the hand. They took the sea's most dangerous swimmers and learned to move alongside them in the deep water. And 3 days ago on this very station, I watched a human child, a juvenile barely 7 years old, hold one of the most irrationally aggressive creatures in the known galaxy in her arms while it slept." The assembly was utterly silent. "I was there," Rethka said. "I stood in that corridor with my claws extended, and my pack in combat formation, and I watched that child do something that none of us could do, not with all our strength, and all our weapons, and all our centuries of evolution. She reached out with an open hand, and the creature chose to trust her. Rethka straightened to her full height, nearly 3 meters of scaled muscle and military authority, and she spoke the next words with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. I propose a new classification, she said, one that has never existed before because it has never been needed before. Tier 0, Bonded Apex, a species that achieves dominance not through individual strength, but through an ability to forge alliances across biological boundaries that no other known species in the galaxy possesses. The hall erupted. Delegates surged to their feet, and voices crashed against each other in a wave of outrage and disbelief and fear and fascination, and the translation field struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of simultaneous speech. The Krethvari delegation leader slammed one massive armored fist against the table and declared that creating a new tier was an insult to every species that had earned its rank through proven combat superiority. The Herbivore Coalition argued that elevating a Deathworld species above all others would destabilize the entire political balance of the Accord. 3 separate Predator delegations filed formal objections on the grounds that no species should receive a classification higher than Tier 1, without demonstrating military dominance in sanctioned conflict. Rethka stood on the stage through all of it, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and she waited with the patience of a predator who knew that the prey would eventually tire. When the noise finally subsided, she said one thing more. "The humans have a saying," she said. "They say, 'Make love, not war.' I once believed this was the motto of a weak species, a species that could not fight, and so chose to surrender before the battle began. I was wrong. It was never a plea." She looked directly at Kale Marin. It was a warning. The vote was called. It passed by a margin of 3, a razor-thin majority that reflected the deep divisions in the assembly, with the Vashkari military bloc providing the decisive swing votes that tipped the ballots. Humanity was classified as Tier 0, Bonded Apex, the first and only species to ever hold that designation. Kale Marin sat in his seat, breathed out slowly. His hands were shaking slightly, and beside him, Lily was feeding Sergeant Grumbles a piece of dry fruit that she had smuggled from the diplomatic lounge. She had no idea that the course of human galactic history had just changed forever. "Dad," she said, "can we go to the observation deck? I want to look at the stars." "Yes," he said. "Yes, we can." Was a long, curved room with a transparent wall that looked out into open space, and the stars hung in the darkness like scattered diamonds on black velvet. And Lily sat on the floor with Sergeant Grumbles in her lap, and she was happy in the simple and complete way that only children can be happy. The deck was empty, except for her. And then it was not. A small figure appeared at the far end of the room, a Vashkari juvenile, barely taller than Lily, with scales that shimmered between pale green and a nervous flickering yellow. It was Rethka's child, her offspring brought aboard the station after the Accord had concluded, because Rethka had made a decision that her child would see the humans before the cultural briefings, and the political analyses, and the military assessments could teach the young one to see them through the lens of fear. The Vashkari juvenile stood at the edge of the observation deck, with its claws half extended, and its tail curled tight against its leg, and every line of its small body radiating the kind of terror that comes from being young and meeting something completely unknown. Lily looked up. She saw the small alien child standing alone and trembling, and she smiled, not a careful diplomatic smile, and not a calculated gesture of goodwill, but the real and radiant smile of a 7-year-old who had just spotted a potential friend. She extended one hand, palm up, fingers relaxed, the same gesture she had used with the honey badger. "Hi," she said. Do you want to pet him? He is really soft once he likes you. The Vaskari juvenile looked at Lily's hand, and then looked across the room to where Rethka stood in the doorway, barely visible in the shadows, watching. Rethka nodded, just once. The juvenile took a step forward, and then another, and then it was close enough to reach out, and its small clawed hand trembled in the air between them. Lily took the Vaskari child's hand in hers, and guided it gently to the honey badger's back, and Sergeant Grumbles opened one eye, and looked at the alien fingers touching his fur, and he made a sound that was not quite a growl, and not quite a purr, but something in between. And then he closed his eye, and went back to sleep. The Vaskari juvenile's scales shifted to a color that Lily had never seen, something warm and bright and soft, like the first light of morning. He is soft, the juvenile whispered. I told you, Lily said. They sat together on the floor of the observation deck, with the stars spread out before them, and a honey badger sleeping between them, and their hands still touching. Tiny human fingers and tiny clawed fingers resting side by side on the fur of a creature that feared nothing in the universe, except, perhaps, the possibility of not being held. Across the room, Rethka watched from the doorway, and she felt her claws retract for the second time in 3 days. But by instinct, by something old and deep and wise that lived beneath thought. The humans had a saying she had only recently learned. Make love, not war. She had once found it laughable, the motto of a weak species afraid of its own shadow. Now, watching her child hold hands with a Death Worlder's daughter, while a creature of pure biological defiance slept peacefully between them, she understood what the words truly meant. It was never a plea from the powerless. It was never a surrender before the battle. It was a promise from a species that had tamed wolves, and ridden horses, and held honey badgers, and crossed the stars with open hands. A species that could have chosen to be the most terrifying force the galaxy had ever seen, and instead chose every single time to reach out and try to make a friend. It was not a plea. It was a warning, and it was the most beautiful warning the galaxy had ever received.